We all have lots of third-party tools that we use, and a lot of those are used for our edges and understanding our postures and measuring those. I mean, you look at the number of posture management tools out there, whether it's cloud or AI or SaaS or whatever. As a product company, if I get to a point where all code I push is secure, do I even need 80% of that?
I'm still paranoid about the ecosystem. So as all the good stuff that these models and agents can bring, there's still some things to work out around, just like we had to do with SaaS, right? Who owns the keys? Where's the data? Who else has access to it on the back end and all of those things? But I think that's something that we still need to work out and be cognizant of as a community.
Everybody, welcome back to Somaini's Trust Issues. I'm Justin Somaini. Today, I am really excited because I have two fantastic individuals and security leaders, Jason Lish, CISO of Cisco, and Iain Mulholland, CISO of Salesforce. Today's a little bit different. Usually I have on a lot of vendors. Where's the innovation in cyber and where do we identify it? Not unlike the episode with Omar Santos, I really want to hit from a practitioner's standpoint around the intersection of AI and security. What are the challenges that we face, but also what are the opportunities as well? And I couldn't think of two better individuals to really have this conversation with other than Jason and Iain, because they're on the front lines of that. And so Jason, Iain, hey, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. There's probably, when I break it down, there's probably three things to really meta topics to really hit, and just putting it out there. One is this vulnerability remediation problem. I don't want to, label it a specific model because I think it's not that. It's exasperated, and we can dig into that one. The second one is, how do we secure the production agents or production AI? And how do we secure the workstation utility, the corporate space, AI adoption? Maybe they're the same, maybe they're different, but a good conversation nonetheless. And maybe the third one is, what does this mean? And what are the opportunities for the security function itself? Do we have a skill set change? Do we have an opportunity to advance the security program? So those were the three that was top of mind. And maybe we just start off with the biggest one that everybody is really focused on, which is this whole CVE explosion, AI finding vulnerabilities, et cetera. And maybe just kind of feeding to the point a little bit. I did a little bit of data. And since 2018, the mean time to exploit, 2018 was roughly 840 days. I think this is coming from the zerodayclock.com site. It has decreased to today, which is less than about 5 hours. Now that is, once an advisory is released, the exploit is released within 5 hours. They're leveraging AI to do the reverse engineering, find the exploit code, and then publish it. Along the same path, in 2018, we had the CVE explosion, roughly 18,000 in 2018. 2025, at the end, was about 50,000 CVEs. Roughly last month, I think, is when I pulled up the data. We had already 30,000 CVEs, and we haven't even gotten through the middle of the year. And so the ability to have AI analyze, and I think this is mostly open source code, analyze that code, find vulnerabilities, and push them out. Along the way, and I took this from Verizon's DBER report, the average patch remediation timeframe still settles roughly around 30 days. And I think that's a prioritization of those vulnerabilities, not all vulnerabilities. So this is really setting the table for the discussion of, this is a big, big problem of how do we solve it? And so maybe I just throw it out there. How do you guys think about this? And Jason, maybe for you first.
Yeah, so I guess the first question is, what's a CVE anymore? in terms of how we look at a vulnerability. So, to your point, I mean, the data is staggering in terms of the time to weaponize as well as the sheer number that we're dealing with. So really the way that we're thinking about it, or I'm thinking about it, is, how do we get to a point where we can first prioritize what we need to focus on? So the whole exploitability and reachability is a key component in really understanding, if I've got 1 million vulnerabilities in my environment, what's actually important that I need to go after from a criticality standpoint? That's the first thing. The second thing, and I know others have brought this up, Justin, in your track, but the whole notion of compensating controls becomes, more critical now, because we can't just rely on patching and trying to cram that down IT and engineering in the BU's throats all the time. Now we need to modernize so we can patch quicker and we can deploy compensating controls faster. But we do need mechanisms where we can buy more time, to really assess and understand, where we need to push on and take those risks to patch faster. So, as a networking company, I'm a bit biased around how do we push more things in the edge? How do we rely on segmentation, distributed firewall, layers 1 through 4 blocking? Can we deploy shields that, are compensating controls? Now, I'm not saying that this is the end all be all and we shouldn't patch, but I think we need to think about that resiliency and the different tools that we should be applying in our toolbox besides just applying a patch, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo that. I think a lot of us hit a point, and sorry for my co-worker. I think a lot of us hit a point, several years ago where we kind of realized that finding vulnerabilities is actually not hard. In relative terms, it's how do you actually take that from a vulnerability, figure out what the actual risk is, and then have that risk mitigate. And Jason hit, a bunch of the things that, we're doing, have been thinking about for a long time. I think, and I'm sure we'll get onto this later, a really big advancement is around being able to use AI to actually determine exploitability and reachability. We've been talking about that for a long time. But now we're actually able to do it at scale. And I will tell you, based on, multiple experiences of this, when you start to take your list of kind of like P0s or your CVSS 9.3 and above, or whatever, and you start running those through, robust exploitability and reachability frameworks, you can compress that down to single digit percentages. And so now you're able to actually, instead of running around like a headless chicken trying to patch all the things, which none of us have been able to figure out how to do, you can really focus on these are the ones where it's like, I really need to get this patched quickly. Or to Jason's point, I need to have a robust compensating control, or preferably both, in a very short order. And so, understanding exploitability, understanding reachability, which is not something that happens overnight. You've got to kind of like build out frameworks to help you understand that, and particularly in large complex environments. And then also understanding what those compensating controls are and being able to activate or enable those controls in real time. Have your SOC be able to analyze the vulnerability, analyze the CVE coming in, and very quickly determine, okay, can we flip a switch on a compensating control here quickly? And in many cases, I've already thought about even, in some cases, there may be a degradation to service resulting from that. I already have had that business conversation to say, hey, we will accept that. So I think that's where we're, many of us are moving. And it is actually one area that I think AI helps us.
Well, a quick question. I think there's obviously, how do we get better at multiple layers of defense of what is in production or what is live or runtime? The first question that goes into, are we being thoughtful about even what goes into production to begin with? And so we have these open source minimization solutions that are out there, which talk about reducing the footprint of the code like 90%, as well as the vulnerabilities. But that concept of how do we get back to, in a waterfall model, concept of how do we harden the image before it's released? And that part of that is stripping out unnecessary things. So what we need to patch is more dramatically shrunk. Is that part of the thought process for you guys, or is that, hey, we tried it, didn't work, or
no,
whatever?
Definitely.
Yeah.
But I think what I've realized is that attack surface reduction is not a one-time effort. It's a continuous, because your attack surface just, kind of like organically grows on its own, because the business is evolving and the business is going, oh, let's try this new thing. Oh, it's like, oh, we're a product company just like Cisco are. It's like, oh, let's launch this new product. And so your attack surface is increasing every single day. And if you don't have conscious programs, and I say programs plural, that are thinking about how do we map attack surface and then just kind of like, bring it back down, then, you lose control. But specifically to your point, thinking about things like images and open source, the risk is that if you don't have mechanisms to measure and inventory and understand that, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, your sprawl will continue. And so you just have to actively be doing that. And some of the tools like operating system hardening, I mean, we've been, hardening operating systems since the early days of Windows. It's not a new technique. AI, just kind of accelerates the need to, it's kind of like new attack vectors, but old techniques still very much work.
Yeah.
I would just add that, we're changing the tires on a moving bus here, right? Because we've got legacy, footprint that we're dealing with. So yes, we're developing North Star pipelines, and, we can name vendors that are helping us to deliver hardened images, to try to stop the bleeding. But to Ian's point, we've got 30-year-old products, that are in production that has compounded code, that we've just never gone through. Many product vendors have never gone through and really cleaned that up to really understand, from a quote unquote SBOM perspective, what should really be in there from a proprietary and open source perspective. The other thing I would say is, we can all take a shot, with projects like Glasswing and Daybreak and others. I think there's hope because we are going through, with our harness and identifying where there's unused code and where we can replatform. And, we've gone through probably about 2.2 billion lines of code now. And we would have never been able to do that, prior to a lot of these frontier models that, we've been talking about. So I think there's hope that we can expedite that minimization. And then, Justin, as you know, there's startups and others that are really bringing hope to that space as well.
It's interesting you bring up the, let's call it the legacy or the tech debt problem, for lack of a better word. How do we, fix the mainframe, the DECVAXs of the world?
Those are the safest.
I mean,
they are.
Bring back DOS.
When was the last time you saw a VMS, a VMS CD?
In the news, yeah.
Yeah, to get one under for research is quite expensive. But you had your whole, identity authentication authorization layer in one environment, making it massively easy to secure, or easier. But, I'm sure there's a chock full of issues, but this tech debt problem. And Ian, I mean, Cisco's been around a bit longer than Salesforce, but I assume that tech debt challenge is still alive and well, even in your environment. Are you finding the same problems?
Finding the same problems, but to the same point that, Jason makes, I also have an element of hope because, we're a 27-year-old company, I think. Guess what? We are still running code that was written 27 years ago. And it is code that generates revenue. So it's not like we're just going to turn on and throw that out or, go and, replace it willy-nilly. But what the harnesses allow us to do is to, at scale, go and assess that code in ways that we have not done before or not been able to do before. And that's actually really promising for us to be able to go in and look at that. And, what's interesting is, of course, we're finding issues, but actually we're also, because we're coupling that with the ability to demonstrate exploitability or not demonstrate, as may be the case, we're actually able to do a much better risk assessment on the general health of that code. And so far, I think we tend to be very pessimistic about what we don't know. Now that we're turning the unknown into a bit more of a known, I'm generating more confidence around that. That's not to say we don't have work to do there, but I now have an understanding of the posture of that code, and we couldn't do that previously. It just was, you just couldn't throw enough humans at it. But you throw these harnesses at it and, you're getting it done. It's like a 4-hour run in a harness and boom, you're like, you understand what's actually going on in that code. That's pretty powerful.
So tell me more about this harness. Did you roll your own or using COSI or multiple harnesses? What does that look like?
So I think the first thing is that, and it's funny, one of the other topics you talked about later is, skill set. So a little teaser for that is, I'm trying to figure out what the right job description is for harness engineer, because it's there is a new role, which is literally, the person who builds harnesses. So we have multiple harnesses. Those are home built. They're conceptually, probably quite similar to what Jason has done, what other companies have done, because in actual fact, we've all talked to each other and said, how are you doing this? How are you doing that? They're built to, initially they were frankly running off a security engineer's laptop, just to kind of get them up proof of concept. Now we have them running in full production environments where we're starting to build out, kind of self-service so that our many product teams are not, blocked by waiting for security to onboard them. So they're actually very, very quickly becoming a core part of the kind of security apparatus that we have. And as I said, it's becoming multiple.
Yeah, just to kind of drive the value aspect of having the right harness. So we had been down this path for probably a year prior to Glasswing coming into play, and we were primarily using the harness and experimenting with it for SaaS, white box, code scanning, using models like Opus and others. And so obviously it was a new frontier for our offensive testing team, but when Mythos came around, we were able to plug that in and really start to understand the power of the harness. And just to give you an idea from a tuning perspective, when we first started the vulnerability identification, we mapped it out to about $800 of vulnerability, per the token cost. Because of the optimization of the harness, we've got that down to $108 of vulnerability now. And wow. So, when you think about the expertise needed to design the right harness, especially as we think about token costs and, what other types of models should we be leveraging with the harness, whether it's small language models or, internal ones or cheaper, from a tiered perspective, I think that's going to be a necessary skill set and factor, for all of us as we continue down this path.
So when you are able to run your code through these harnesses for issue identification, vulnerability identification, couple of questions. One, and I'm kind of leading the witness a little bit here, but is there a difference in the models and what they're good at, and how do you handle that? The second one is, are you going beyond just detection and moving into remediation as well? So in other words, hey, we found a code issue. We're actually going to fix the code and send it on and commit it, to therefore reducing the labor component on the engineer times. And then last question is, what are the things that you did not expect in that process that came out?
I'll quickly touch on the first elements, and then I'm sure Iain can weigh in. As we look at some of these unguarded models, particularly that are more expensive, we're trying to hone in on, what they're really good at, chaining vulnerabilities together so that we know exactly what we need to go after from a remediation standpoint. And what I mean by that is if we use the model to find a privilege escalation that leads to a buffer overflow that leads to X to Y, you could say that's 4 vulnerabilities. But if we address the privilege escalation the three other vulnerabilities may not matter from a priority perspective. So how do we really leverage the model to say, what is really what we need to prioritize here when we go to the engineering team? Because we don't want to throw them every vulnerability. So what are the ones that matter the most? That's the first thing. The second thing is, the proof of concept, so that when we, go back to the engineers and say, here's a recommended remediation, we can show, that there is a proof of concept for an exploit. The, higher powered frontier models are really good at that. What I don't want to use a frontier model is going and finding documentation, dissecting binary. So there's things that I'd rather have sub-agents that are using other types of models that are lower cost, that then are feeding that context into those higher powered models, so that you're kind of reducing the signal to noise to go after what you really need to.
Yeah, we've got a very similar setup, and it's a pipeline. I think to one of your questions, what the frontier models are really good at is actually code. That's what a lot of their training was on. And so in terms of really being able to understand the code, to the point that Jason made, they're looking at an exploit chain and figuring out, okay, if you break the chain here, everything else doesn't really matter. And then I think the other thing that's been really important for us is, and all three of us have worked in large product companies. That if you find a vulnerability in a product, you take a P0 over to a product team, they're going to start litigating it because they've got 100 other P0s and they're trying to ship their product. And look, we're product companies and we want them to ship their products. So there's always this tension of, well, is your P0, really a P0? The really good thing about the frontier models is you can, instead of you taking them just a CVSS score, you can take them an exploit and you can turn around and say, we're not going to litigate this. And we've actually internally, had a very robust conversation with our engineering leaders, to the point where they've recognized it's like, if we bring them something that's got, basically a tag identified with a frontier model, demonstrated exploit, it's like, there's no litigation. It's now the discussion is, when's the PR getting pushed? So then the last thing that, you talk about, I think where good harnesses are rapidly moving to, and we're definitely experimenting with this, is that they actually propose the PR. Now, do we get to a state where I think security is pushing? I don't think so, at least in large companies. But clearly, if you can turn around to an engineering team, going back to the point of they're really busy trying to ship, product, you turn around and go, you've got a, critical security vulnerability, but here's the PR. You're making it much more easy for them. And candidly, as security professionals, you're making it much more likely that you're going to get your risk remediated. And so that's definitely something that, we're actively experimenting with and, going to build into our systems.
Just one other piece as an example. So when we first got access to Mythos, we actually compared it to our agentic SOC. So we had built a lot of our co-analyst SOC capabilities based on Llama, running in our Bedrock instance, training it on our ticket data and our processes and things like that. And when we plugged Mythos to compare, it actually performed, more poorly than what we had built. And I bring that up because, as Iain mentioned, that Mythos is really good at code. And, it may not be good at other things that, we purposely trained. And the reason why I raise that is a lot of the conversations that I've had with peers, it's like, well, I'm just going to use Mythos and I'm just going to point it at everything. And I think selecting the right models, based on purpose and cost and use case functionality are going to be very important for us.
I think there's a really interesting thing. And again, we could go down a half-hour rabbit hole on this, or even do a whole podcast on this, but I'll throw something out there because I love, Jason and I have had some conversations in the past about, cost. And, historically, as security professionals, we've never really had to think about unit economics. But we're now at a point where unit economics are very obvious. And if you think about when AWS kind of came out, 15 years ago, within a couple of years, we had this whole new profession called cloud economists. And these were people who could turn on and go, here's how you optimize your AWS bill. I actually think there is a missing speciality right now in security called security economics, because here's the thing. if you can use a frontier model to find a vulnerability for about $100, but, it's costing you $10,000, to mitigate that vulnerability or find it, for example, in cloud security posture management or whatever. It's like now when I'm evaluating tools and, my vendor portfolio, am I getting to a point where it's like I'm asking them, what is your unit cost to identify a vulnerability? And then am I now looking at what's my unit cost or what's my cost to remediate? We've never had that before. I think it's a fascinating area. I think it's very, very early. But
well, I think people have tried, but we never had really clear data from an industry. Yeah. Same thing on, the risk models, the financial analysis of like FAIR and others, and the risk models, where I don't think we had good enough statistical data to really drive, the understanding. And when you do it on a product by product basis, the chain of issues were so complex that people are like, okay, I've got real work that's in front of me. Now, maybe with the advent of AI, maybe it's more a realistic possibility.
Yeah, because you can't necessarily measure the consumption of a human like you can, with model usage and the token consumption aspect. So it's a really good point that, now just like cloud consumption, can we get to a point where we're actually able to quantify a process end to end and show, as we could drive down costs? Because if I optimize a process and then, I let go a few engineers, and I have others absorb that, it's always been hard for us to say, are we, we do all these benchmarks, are we, at peer, but now I think we can start to compare, true actual costs in our programs.
Well, I think there's definitely an optimization possibility, but as an industry, I think we need to go through the ability to actually consume the workload of the business. For example, since we're talking about code analysis and remediation, historically it's been labor centric. So that we just prioritize which code we're going to review versus reviewing all code to make sure we are exhaustive. And so going through implementing these harnesses, going through that model, getting that first round of kind of efficiencies and implementation is the first step. And then being able to drive in an optimization path, I think probably makes a lot of sense, right? But Iain, I want to go back to the remediation. And you said the adjudication from engineers on issues. Historically, that's been, okay, hey, I've got a paycheck. That paycheck is driving me to create feature functionality. Now I've got to disrupt that or work more hours to do vulnerability remediation, has created that tension when things come in. But it seems to me that if we're able to analyze it and say, here's the PR, you just need to do like 0.5% or 2%, insert some number here of the previous workload to actually do that, it would be a lot more capabilities of driving in that remediation. And the engineers are like, we've seen 50 of these, 49 of them were good to go. So we have high confidence on what is coming out is healthy, effective, and not needing changes. Is that what you're seeing, or is it completely different? And same thing to you, Jason.
I think, stepping it back for a second, one of the interesting things with, with these harnesses is my overall vulnerability count is going up, but my actual count of vulnerabilities that I'm taking to engineers going, thou needs to fix this now, is actually relatively steady. And it's because of the fact that I'm able to turn around and take the entire cohort of things that, score at CVSS 10.0 and go, but these are the ones that are actually truly exploitable. Okay. And so there's that value is like, that for me has been a step function, but then, the all the way, building that pipeline all the way through to the point where the engineer on the product team just goes, oh, that's cool, click. And now that PR's in, and so from the harness finding it to the PR being pushed is, measured in basically the speed that the engineer can hit the button. The broader conversation there is around just generally AI generated PRs, and not just security PRs, but AI generated code and pushing that to production. And, how do you meet your quality bars? And I think, leading engineering cultures and companies have very active conversations. There's a very active conversation in Salesforce about how do we maintain our availability standards, as an example, when we're driving much faster cycle time on, code generation. So what's good is we've actually been involved in that conversation and have been helping, because security is one of the drivers, but it's not the only driver. I mean, we have feature breaks in our products that are affecting customers that have nothing to do with security, and we want to get them out to production fast. So how do you increase that cycle time? Is a very active conversation. As I say, we're driving it. I think we will get to a place where remediation at a code level becomes automated, or at least highly automated. We may still have human in the loop for some risky use cases. And certainly when we look at data, the data is supporting that the code quality is there. It's more about our engineering practices and our engineering confidence catching up to go, actually, this is okay. And then what's the rollback in the event that, you do have that one PR that goes and breaks something.
But wouldn't that drive a increase, or at least in the short term, an increase of PR? Basically, what is the point of prioritization at that point, since we're able to drive full remediation at scale with low labor? Right.
Well, I think the challenge there is, at the end of the day, software is still, can be fragile. And so, what's really interesting is that, where I sit in Salesforce, one of my peers is the chief availability officer. And, there's this constant tension between, pushing a lot of changes versus, minimizing change, because the only thing that affects availability is the change. And so, if you want maximum availability, you just don't change anything. Of course, that's not realistic. And so where's the tension? I think the nice thing is that actually we can turn around and go, sure, in kind of like what is rapidly becoming the legacy system, CVSS. In the legacy system, this thing was high priority. But in a new system, which is much more kind of like, exploitability and reachability, 90% of these things are actually not critical. And so, I mean, like internally, we're actually very actively developing a new prioritization system based on exploitability.
Jason, you were shaking your head like I was crazy in pushing the boundaries. Your thoughts?
Well, I think maybe we can get there at some point as we continue to modernize our, pipelines and our code bases. But I think right now we still need human in the loop and, the checks and balances, so for example, for us, any recommended PRs, they still go through a human process and then a QA process, just because like what Iain mentioned, the balance of the quality, availability, and introducing other issues. But I will say, and Justin, I know you had conversations with Omar about, the concept of code guard and other, types of skill capabilities that, that how do we feed back the lessons that we're learning through these harnesses into our AI coding agents, so we're not reintroducing the same issues. So I think as we propagate that and, we continue with release processes, we're going to chip away at this pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because we're not talking about a static one-path remediation. Hey, remediation of code is the only issue, but it's also the badness coming in. We talked about minimizing the open source images, but as developers move from hands-on coding to actually leveraging coding agents or coding models, we should have more effective, clean, and secure code coming out. It's astonishing to me how bad, as an industry-wide, engineers have not been able over the past 20, 25, 30 years to still clean up input sanitization issues or memory issues, etc. But with the introduction of those skills, it's just built into the fabric of how code is developed. And so we should have a cleaner product going in while we are cleaning up that legacy tech debt to, hey, maybe in 2 to 3 to 5, whatever kind of future time frame, have a very different world of what we're talking about. Is that a pipe dream, or is that kind of what you're seeing the beginning stages of?
Yeah, I mean, Ian, I don't know where you all are at, or, comparing notes with others, but I mean, 80 to potentially 90% of our code, is either currently or will be AI generated, through these coding agents. And so, as we continue to train them with the right skills, and I think that's important because, we can't just rely on these coding agents without continuously training them and making sure there's a feedback loop. I do think we can get there.
Yeah, I think it was Jen Easterly wrote an essay last year, The End of Cybersecurity as We Know It, or something, that was kind of like hinting at this. Again, one of the things that we're working on right now, and I know Jason and others are working on this as well, is we've done all these scans on this code. Well, guess what? There's patterns. It's developers, make the same, patterns. It's like, hey, we've got access management issues. We've got cloud configuration issues, et cetera, et cetera. None of them are particularly surprising, but now we're able to categorize them much more accurately and at much better scale. Well, guess what? The next thing is, how do we take those failure patterns, those anti-patterns, and feed them forward into the coding agents so that, they act as guardrails there. And basically, we do actually genuinely and legitimately eradicate that class of vulnerability. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think we can. I think we can get there, at least for the new code. Now, again, we talked about it earlier. There's still all the legacy code, and we've got to figure out, okay, what do we do with that? Does that get rewritten over time? Does it get retired over time? I don't think we've got that figured out, but certainly moving forward, is there a scenario where in a couple of years' time, most code getting written is generally vulnerability free, or free of the vulnerabilities that we understand today? Because who knows, there could be a whole different class of vulnerabilities that we're not even thinking about. But I don't think it's Pollyannish. I think we can get there.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I haven't seen any new class, meta class of issues in code in like 15, 20 plus years. And so all of we're identifying is stuff that was already known about. Look at the OWASP top 10 or 15 or 20, whatever, been the same thing. So training today, or having those skills or having those models on what we already know, I would put it in the 95+% of issues that are there. And it kind of lends going through a couple of cycles. I think a company such as both of yours, as big and complex as they are, but you're leaning into this and have been doing it for a while, fast forward 4 years, 3 to 4 years, it is materially different.
Yeah. And I guess I'll just do a public service announcement. And this is a little bit different for us because we have hardware and software, but we are not targeting end of life code and products. So, just to plug on like end of life, end of support, and just currency in general, like it was a problem before. It's going to be additionally an issue now, as a lot of these product providers out there, are prioritizing their newer platforms. And so, I think statistically, just from a Cisco perspective, about 48% of our equipment out there is end of life, end of support. And so that's highly concerning because we're not going back and cleaning up, 15-year-old products that we no longer support.
Well, I will spin down my very old checkpoint firewall because I'm sure everybody's got the same issue. You've got a different problem as well, as just because you fix the code doesn't mean your customers have implemented that fix. And so that, how do you push them to do the right thing? Or is it, hey, all of our customers are pretty much the largest governments, the largest companies, and so they're on it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, I think, a lot of the conversation we opened up with first we're trying to help our customers provide visibility into their environments because, they may not even know where all their end of life or end of support stuff is that they have to go, target, and then what's externally facing versus internal. So we are trying to help with that visibility aspect, give them the telemetry to help make informed decisions. And I think, like all of us, we've been saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think CEOs now, they were saying, well, we can push that investment off another year. Now it's like it's a security issue now, and so I think it's driving a whole level of conversation of relevance and importance. So I think the combination of just the whole wave of criticality that we've seen in the last 6 months, understanding where we're going with the speed and pace of these models and what the adversaries are going to potentially have in their hands, as well as understanding how bad, it is in our customers' environments. So, and then there's the whole, all right, let's figure out this together and partner and, all the things that we need to do around that.
Switching gears a little bit, Iain, I'm curious of your thoughts, but maybe kicking off the second meta point, but when you think of your production environments, let's focus on there. I know you have, I think you call it the Salesforce Agent OS or the Salesforce OS. Maybe I got that wrong, but really that harness that secures the production AI services. How do we identify and prevent, attacks on the models? How do we make sure that identities and authorization and all this stuff of security that we think about is implemented in a healthy framework? To me, the security of AI production services is really all about that harness and the orchestration. Does that resonate, or hey, we've done that and it's something a little bit different? Or
yeah, I think you're talking about our Agent Force
thank you.
Product solution. And so I mean, it's resonating with customers because a lot of customers are, they're trying to figure out how, their customers are pushing them, for AI, or they're seeing their peers or their competitors and they're going, how the hell do I, agentify my business? But I need to be able to do it, in a secure fashion. And they're not necessarily, as far down the AI journey as we are. Mm-hmm. And so, it is, and whilst the name is Agent Force, I think you kind of defaulted to a reasonable kind of like way of thinking about it. Is it's an agentic OS, and I do think we need to see more of those platforms where customers are able to get the benefits of a platform and then focus on what it is that they want for their business outcomes, and then get all of the identity, the security, the guardrails. And so, I wasn't expecting to do a product pitch on Agent Force, but I actually have spent some time trying to understand it. And I do think that type of approach is appropriate. I think that the other thing that's been interesting for me is, as I've, tried to rationalize, and, we've all been in the industry, 20, 30 years, and we've seen lots of patterns, and we just naturally end up being pattern matchers. And I've been trying to figure out, not only in this case, but also in my own, like on the internal enterprise side of Salesforce, agents, what the hell are they? How the hell do I think about them? How do I reason about them? And a metaphor that works for me is in some ways they're a little bit like containers. A container was, it's just a runtime designed for, typically for a specific purpose. Some of them are very, very ephemeral, and they sprawl. And in some ways, I think that's what we're trying to solve with Agent Force, but it's also what I'm trying to figure out how to solve on my enterprise side. How do I just figure out where the hell these agents are? What are they doing? How do I life cycle them? How do I manage them? And I think we're all trying to get that figured out. But it's a metaphor that's worked for me is it's kind of a little bit like containers, and we need you think about all the tooling that appeared after Kubernetes came out to help us manage that. We're in the early part of that same sort of journey, I think.
But did you go down a hey, we're going to create a secure harness that the engineers adopt when they build their agent kind of models, or is it still organic down that path? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So, agents that are delivered externally to our customers are delivered through Agentforce. So it is a platform level strategy. Yeah. It's platform for the security, and also just generally, it's good practice to build so you can build a common delivery harness. And we use, Agentforce internally for, many of our own, kind of like internal IT type use cases as well. And it's not just got security benefits, it's got time to market benefits. The engineer is focused on, what do I want this agent to do? They're not having to figure out all the plumbing. Yeah. So we were lucky. I think we were thinking about it early, that we built out this platform. And so as a consequence, I think we've got a good position from a product point of view, but also internally, I have less of a sprawl problem, because the natural gravity, Agentforce was kind of available before most people were starting to try and build agents internally. So, but I think we were, that was a little bit of luck, candidly. I think, not everybody's as lucky.
Jason, did you have the same kind of pathway?
So I'll use a different example. So when we started to go down the Gen AI path, years ago, we had built out a platform called Circuit. And so it leverages about 17 different models. It'll select, the best one based on your prompt and, what you're trying to do to try to contain costs. Or you can select one, depending on what you're trying to do. And so organically, that started to become our agent builder and our platform for employees to be able to spin up, bots and things like that. But now we're rolling out something called Pulse, which is a digital twin for every employee in the company. And so now the discussion is when you take a digital twin that has access, and Justin, I know you've done some of this with Claude and some other things. It's one thing to have inferred ownership or inferred access, based on your identity, what you have access to in terms of Slack or Jira, email and things like that, versus, full agentic agents that communicate with other agents. So we're having those discussions of do we apply the same controls to the digital twin as we do, the full agentic agents, or do we just trust that, the identity that I have and what I have access to, I can just give that to my agent and let it, run free based on what I want it to do. So, that's, and like Iain mentioned, the whole registration management, MDM type concept of agents, identity, lifecycle management. By the way, the analogy I use is they're like teenagers. You've got to nurture them, and they do stupid stuff, and you got to bring them back, and then eventually, hopefully, you can set them off to college and all that good stuff.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully.
Well, I mean, you bring up identity, and for me, the agent identity concept, and this is a question. One, if I'm creating it for my workloads, to kind of lessen Justin's work on a daily basis, read emails, whatever. It cannot extend beyond my authorization to any service, but more than likely, it should be a subset of my authorization. If I'm building a production agent, something to go off, and obviously that's very different. That's something to have access to that generally I would not, but that's built for purpose. The problem is we have really done poorly as an industry managing authorization because we have not centralized it. It's still distributed to all of these services. Authorization is a really, really bad situation for almost every company across industry. Maybe a couple of key services, they focus, they audit it once a quarter, whatever. But now we're pushing that authorization concept and work to an individual to say, hey, Justin, you created an email review and a drafter. You need to figure out the authorization for that agent, or, hey, you've written 15, so do that. That's never going to happen in a great degree. Does that resonate? Or if it does, how are you guys thinking about that? Solving it, that is.
take that, Iain?
Oh, look at Iain.
Yeah, I think, it's funny. What agents are going to force us to do, regardless of what the solution ends up being, whether it's like, we have just-in-time tokens and they have supervisor agents and figuring out intent and all that sort of stuff. One of the things that I think it probably is going to force us to do is just clean up identity, period, whether it's non-human or human, because identity always biases to over-provisioning because everybody has work that they need to get done. Yeah. So that's the kind of epiphany that's gone off for me. I'll be honest, I don't actually know what the solution is. And, there's a lot of startups in this space, and I've been pitched, a dozen ways till Sunday, and nothing is clicking yet. So I think generally people still haven't, unlike, say, MCP servers. Well, I came out really quickly and they're like, oh, okay, that's the way you access, programmatically. There's no analog has appeared yet. And I think we're all kind of dancing around the issue, waiting for that to appear.
Iain, I completely agree. Only if there was somebody that took their free time to focus on where the innovation was in some of these root problems, and then to take the corpus of vendors and get it to a quality handful that you really should focus on. They probably should call it Trust Issues Podcast or something.
I don't know.
That.
I mean, there's an opportunity there, Justin.
I think there's a harness for that.
Yeah.
There is, actually, but besides the point. No, but I mean, in all seriousness, there have been a bunch of startups in this space around identities, the authorization, and then the continuous monitoring of what they actually use to get to that least privilege kind of concept, which I think is fantastic because it's not a technical problem. It's a labor problem. And nobody has time to go through all of the logs to identify what does Justin actually use, to then say, you don't really need this. We're going to remove it out. Yeah, so I completely agree. The other one on the corporate side, as all employees, and Jason, it sounds like you've got this digital twin concept. In other words, all employees can create agents to offload their work. How do you get your hands around it? Are they creating their agents on their workstations? Because we've seen that model before, that sprawl of executables that eventually needs to be wrangled in. Or are you creating centralized service where you're able to apply all of these concepts? It sounds like you're more in the latter organically because of this router-based type hook that you've historically had.
Yeah, and it's we're basing it off of like Nanobot and some other things, but it's a central platform that everything's controlled. I won't, so I don't get made fun of, but I'll say it anyways. The primary platform that we're using is WebEx for the agents to run, just because every employee has the WebEx app and it on their desktop. So we're avoiding any local agent to run, just because we want to make sure that we can apply the controls centrally and have that visibility. And so, but going back to over permissions and, what you should have access, I guess trying to bring in a level of optimism here. Can we start to use these agents to then really profile and start to dwindle down, the least privilege of what we actually access based on our role in day to day? Because trying to manually create these roles over the last 20 years, we've failed miserably, in terms of that. So can we use these agents to actually, with a level of observability, start to create like auto-bound roles within, the user base? I don't know. It's,
Where do we go from here? I mean, the last meta point was really around something that I think about or have thought about for 20 some odd years, which is security as a concept, a functional concept, has not necessarily met the mission. And that has predominantly been around a labor-based constraint that we have had. We can't hire enough people to review all code, to make sure code is out securely, for example, insert that across all processes. Today, I think that we have an amazing opportunity to drive reduction in labor, or in other words, or an inverse, we can drive high automation of the security functional processes to then do two things. One, get a nearly 100% coverage of whatever that thing is. Imagine auditing all of your assets on a daily basis kind of thing versus once a year. And then second, you're delaboring the pushover that we do on engineering, IT, all employees, whatever that is, and allowing them to have a more healthy relationship with the security function in a lot of ways, removing the friction, so to speak. If those two things are true, that we're able, not 100%, but greatly, insert 80, 90% kind of a target of those workloads, assume over like a 5-year period, it's not instantaneous. What does that do to the skill set of the security team itself? To me, I think it looks more like a product team, not completely, but you have, and Iain, you brought this up, of harness engineers. We have more product or delivery folks than before. But that was my mental concept of, hey, this is where it could go. Do you guys have a different opinion on what the future of security functions are and the skill sets?
Well, I think short term, when I look at the amount of work and backlog that we have, so I'll address it in both aspects of what we have today versus where we're going. Like if we look at our risk registers and, the amount of, things that we capture over the years that we just haven't had the ability to go, drive down or work with IT and other functional teams to create the remediation for them, for example. And I know Iain doesn't have this problem, but just like a simple issue of like, I still have apps that don't have single sign-on, or I have, insecure protocols that we know that exist, LDAP, unencrypted LDAP out there. Can I use these agents and other capabilities to really rapidly chip away at that stuff on behalf of the business? So to your point, like, how do we have folks thinking about it from a build standpoint, to be able to spin these things up and go drive some of the burn down, whether it's code minimization or, getting rid of technical debt at a rapid pace, helping to re-platform. I think security is going to play a more important role in that with the use of AI going forward. So skill sets like orchestration, you still need audibility. You still need to understand what these agents are doing. And, there's still a compliance element. I think that's going to be important. Iain mentioned the whole, financial architecture, engineering, tokenization, all of that. I think that's going to be, something. And a lot of us are talking about building our own models as well, because we look at the geopolitical, climate that we're in and, the model infighting that's happening right now. I can't be reliant on, company X versus country Y. And so how do I have, my own capabilities that I can rely on from a resiliency standpoint? Because if we become highly dependent on these models and they're driving a lot of our processes going forward, I've got to make sure that there's resiliency built in as well. And so there's going to be a need for those type of skill sets.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of that. I think certainly in large tech companies, a lot of us have been on a transition for some time to where, the CISO function or the security function is actually an engineering function. And certainly like, in Salesforce, I live in engineering and a substantial number of my, my team are engineers. And I think AI is just going to continue to accelerate that. I think we're going to see, as we just talked there, harness engineers, orchestration engineers, automation engineers expand. The other thing that I think will happen, and I'm already seeing happening, is an up-leveling, and where engineers, I'm not talking, say, security engineers, are able to focus on the highest value tasks. Because agents will do the menial low-level work and they won't complain. The sort of stuff like, back to the whole point about, auditing your identity systems and just cleaning it up. You would give that to the entry-level SOC analyst and, 3 weeks later, you wonder why they kind of quit, because it's just menial, work, but you can fire an agent off of that and then have a higher level. I'll give an example, like, product companies, we do product security reviews. 40% of product security reviews of like a product security engineer's time is literally just going and chasing design docs and figuring out who's the exactly. Yep. Okay. And it's like, who's the product manager? What's the release cycle? When does this actually need to be done? None of that is actually high value security engineering work. We've built an agent right now where, in our release systems, when it's like, oh, there's a release coming up, it literally just goes and collects all the documents and it presents a packet to the security engineer. And it's already done a level 1 analysis and going, oh, this looks like it's a feature, and it's done the basic threat model. It's a feature. It's touching the identity system. And by the way, it's good. It's creating a whole bunch of new S3 buckets. You should go and have a look at this. Mm-hmm. And so now that engineer is spending 80% of their time doing high value work instead of, 40%. So I think we're going to see that kind of like up leveling and the replacement of a lot of the menial stuff, but it's not replacement of the menial stuff, because there's some of it just isn't getting done.
Right. That's right.
Because your SOC leader doesn't want to turn around to the entry level analyst and says your job for the next 3 months is just to go and audit access logs. Yeah. Now you can do that. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't getting done that's getting done, and a whole bunch of stuff where it's more high value. So
no, I completely agree. And fast forward, like say 10 years, I'm just using these windows to kind of differentiate between the creation work, the skill set changes, the creation of the security product, for lack of a better word, and then the long tail of, hey, we fine tune those processes, whether it's, identity and access management reviews or the data lifecycle management, asset lifecycle management, human lifecycle. I mean, all of these things have a fishbone framework of workloads that needs to be worked through in a quote unquote, hey, is this something creative, or is this something that can be transitioned to an agent from a workload and get those efficiencies? And then if you think about it, there's two things that all of you have to handle. One is attrition. Natural attrition of employees all the time. How do you maintain the best and the brightest, i.e. give them more creative work to do versus, Iain, as you're talking about reviewing the logs for what just an access. But over a span of, let's say 10 years of just picking a time frame, you have a very different skill, or a materially different skill and workload of what the humans are doing versus today, and the number of humans, right?
Let me give you another one, since you're talking 10-year time horizon. Yeah. I think that I don't even think this happens in 10 years, but I have we all have lots of third-party tools that we use, and a lot of those are used for, our edges and understanding our postures and measuring those. I mean, you look at the number of posture management tools out there, whether it's cloud or AI or SaaS or whatever. Let's hypothesize this. And we have really big budgets for those tools, and we have really big teams who their job is to run and operate those tools. Now I'm talking as a product company. As a product company, if I get to a point where all code I push is secure, do I even need 80% of that? Do I actually need a huge ops team who's literally their entire job is to, onboard on 3-year, contracts, because we do 3-year contracts because it's a big discount. And frankly, it takes 3 years to implement the damn thing. And so there's a whole sunk cost. And then literally their entire job is to sit in these, those control planes and run these things and create tickets and things like that. I think 80%, I'm actually genuine. I'm kind of hoping 80% of that just goes away, because I can turn around and say the code I pushed was good. It's free of vulnerabilities. Now, of course, the code and, deployment, there's drift, but now we can probably, most of our tooling is just measuring and controlling drift. Mm-hmm. And then if there is a vulnerability escapes, it's all kind of, it's, hey, how do I just push a change out to my WAF or whatever it is. So you want to talk in a 10-year time horizon. I think that there's a big change where a lot of this operational stuff, a lot of this tooling, building and integration of third-party tooling actually potentially evaporates. And it's all about security engineers integrating into build deployment pipelines. And then, network's never going away. Jason's always going to have a job because it's such a good control point. But it actually, if anything, becomes the primary control point.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been talking about that is the network's back, baby. I love it. I absolutely agree. And, you look at ASPM, DSPM, CSPM, how does that look, 5-7 years from now? I think there'll be other, threat vectors introduced and other types of controls we'll have to consider with, where we're going, but which will create a new set of skills that we need. But to your point, I don't think we're going to need, 25 people managing a tool, that is millions and millions of dollars a year.
Yeah.
So, I definitely see that evolving for sure.
And I can recycle that 25 million or whatever it is and, spend half of that on software engineers in my own team that focus on that.
Yeah, the build versus buy, we've been having a lot of discussions around that and what that looks like. And, Justin, to your earlier point, like becoming product organizations. But the other aspect is, are we now support too for the things that we build and maintain? Because, there's always that issue that we've had where, Joe and Bob build something and then, Bob leaves and then Joe retires and then you don't have the commercial contract to fall back on. And so I think we just have to be cognizant of how we think through that as we do start to develop more of our own capabilities as well. The other thing too is, I wouldn't be remiss to say that you're talking to two product, companies, and a lot of this is going to look differently across different verticals. Defense industrial base is thinking about this totally differently than retail and finance. And so I think that answer will depend, based on the segment and, some of the various considerations that these teams have.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the adoption of SaaS as an example of how waves take time to go across verticals differently, I recall significant conversations with non-tech verticals, and they're like, yeah, we're not thinking about it. We'll never go. And that's a very different story 7-8 years later. Usually 7 years is a good marker. Tech is usually in the front of these things. I think this is a bit shorter of a window than 7 years, but definitely there's a majority of companies that are out there, security teams that are not thinking about this because that downward pressure of tech adoption just hasn't been there yet. Of, hey, we need to adopt tech. We need to think through this. And they're going through that. That kicks off that cycle of the security, the CISO's mind of like, how do I think about this new future? What are the patterns that have already been done in industry that I can learn from? I don't think it's 7 years. I think it's going to be shorter, but still there's a gap in time. As a result of that, it's natural that the biggest conversation is around the CVE vulnerability and everything else, but these other more longer in the tail, if you will, topics like, how do we retool all processes like audit compliance, like, identity and access management, et cetera, are incredibly natural for that future, which is why this conversation with the two of you is so incredibly important. So I just want to say thank you, but thank you for anybody who's hopefully listening and curious about this and wanting to learn from two leaders in the industry that are on the tip of the spear, so to speak, for this topic. I retain the permission to recall you back for a conversation. And Iain, I really want to get into the architecture of the harness to defend. That's a personal thing for me. But aside from that, I really do appreciate the conversation. Now, I'm sure everybody can find you, so we're not going to go onto that. But is there anything that we didn't talk about that maybe we should before we start wrapping this up?
I
just put you in the silence. That was fantastic. Was that a monologue? Did I monologue you guys to death? Oh, great.
Yeah, kind of. I'm sure you'll edit that down.
No, verbatim.
I think the last thing, and Iain and I've been talking a lot about this, and it's a new world that we live in. But like I mentioned, the geopolitical, environment that we live in, and I don't know if you all saw, but like the government's investigating AnySphere, who's the parent company of Cursor, because they're using Kimi 2.5, and you've got China saying that they're going to restrict their models. You had the recent Fable 5 and Mythos bans for a while, and then you've got the data retention topic that's coming up of where's the data going. So I'm not, I'm still paranoid about the ecosystem. So as all the good stuff that these models and agents can bring, I think there's still some things to work out around, some of the, just like we had to do with SaaS, right? Who owns the keys? Where's the data? Who else has access to it on the back end, and all of those things. So I think that's something that we still need to work out and be cognizant of as a community.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's something Jason and I are talking about sometimes almost daily. And, I think I spend, as a senior leader, I'm spending as much of my time right now helping educate, our business leadership about the sort of risks and business trade-offs that Jason, just highlighted. And I think every big, certainly, obviously my experiences in product companies, every big product company is thinking about that. And I'm sure every, tech forward company, financial services and things like that are doing it as well. And, I think we're not even at the bottom of the first on this one.
Yeah.
There's a lot more conversations to be had on that one. So.
Well, it sounds like the two of you have trust issues, just like me. Yeah,
we definitely have trust issues.
You got to plug it in there. I got to plug it in there, Iain.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I want to say thank you again. I really appreciate it. I want to be sensitive to time, and you spent a lot of time with me today, and so thank you for that. And maybe we can get into these other topics in another pod.
Yeah. Always great to chat.
Thanks. Great talking to you. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying Trust Issues, please like and leave a 5-star. It really helps. Also, since we take no sponsorships, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider donating to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, by going to give.missingkids.org/trustissues. Any amount will help those kids who need it the most. Lastly, you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. And until next time, thanks and have a great week.